December 7th, 1941, 7:48 a.m. A quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii, and then the sky fills with 353 Japanese warplanes. In under 2 hours, 8 American battleships are burning, nearly 200 aircraft are destroyed, 2,403 Americans are dead. Battleship after battleship rolled over or sank at anchor. Sailors who had been eating breakfast 20 minutes earlier were now fighting fires on decks slick with burning oil. By every measure that mattered in 1941, this was a perfect military operation. And yet, while his pilots celebrated on the flight decks, the man who planned this attack sat alone with a sinking feeling. Because Yamamoto knew something his own government refused to accept. Japan had just guaranteed its own destruction, and the proof would show up in exactly 6 months. Stick around, because the 2 mistakes that sank Japan aren't the ones you'll read in most textbooks. And one of them was avoidable more than a decade before the first bomb ever fell.
Here's what almost nobody tells you. Japan never planned to invade the American mainland. That was never the goal. It wasn't even possible. The real problem was oil. Japan's war machine in China ran almost entirely on American fuel. And in 1941, President Roosevelt shut that tap off completely. With less than a year of fuel left, Japan's military made a desperate bet. Seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and Malaya, by force if necessary. Right up until the final days, diplomats on both sides were still talking. Then, on November 26, 1941, Secretary of State Cordell Hull handed Japan's ambassadors a document demanding a complete withdrawal from China and French Indochina, a condition Japan's military leadership considered a total surrender of everything they'd fought for. Tokyo read it as an ultimatum. 11 days later, the planes launched. There was just one obstacle standing between Japan and the resources it needed, the U.S. Pacific Fleet sitting at Pearl Harbor. So the plan was simple on paper. Cripple the fleet in a single strike, buy Japan 6 months to a year of breathing room, and force Washington to the negotiating table. It was a gamble on a stopwatch, and the moment the bombs stopped falling, that stopwatch started working against Japan.
Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. The attack you just watched wasn't a surprise to everyone. In 1925, 16 years before a single bomb fell on Battleship Row, U.S. Army General Billy Mitchell published a report warning that Pearl Harbor was dangerously exposed to exactly this kind of surprise air raid. He even predicted it would come from carrier-launched planes early on a weekend morning when the base's guard was down. The Navy dismissed him. Mitchell was court-martialed the following year for insubordination. Not for this report specifically, but the warning was buried right along with his career. And it wasn't just Mitchell. In war games throughout the 1930s, American forces staged mock surprise attacks on Pearl Harbor from the air, twice. Both times, the mock attack succeeded completely. The warning wasn't a secret. It was ignored, filed away, and repeated for over a decade, right up until December 7th, 1941, when it stopped being a hypothetical.
Mistake number 1. Japan won a battle against an enemy that had already changed the rules of the game. In 1941, naval doctrine still treated the battleship as the ultimate weapon. Armor, guns, prestige. Entire careers, entire national budgets had been built around the idea that whoever had the biggest, most heavily armored ships won wars at sea. So that's exactly what the Japanese strike force went after. All 8 battleships at Pearl Harbor were sunk or damaged. Mission, by that logic, accomplished. But naval power had already shifted, and Japan's planners hadn't caught up. The real weapon of the next 4 years wasn't the battleship. It was the aircraft carrier. And by sheer chance, not one American carrier was at Pearl Harbor that morning. The USS Enterprise was ferrying planes to Wake Island. The USS Lexington was near Midway. The USS Saratoga was in dry dock on the west coast, hundreds of miles from the attack. Japan destroyed the past. It left the future completely untouched. 6 months later, those same 3 carriers would ambush the Japanese fleet at Midway and sink 4 of the very carriers that had launched this attack. A battle historians now call the turning point of the entire Pacific War. If missing the carriers was bad luck, mistake number 2 was something far more avoidable: hesitation. The attack came in 2 waves, 7:48 a.m. and 8:54 a.m., but Japanese battle plans included a 3rd wave, and this one wasn't aimed at ships at all. Pearl Harbor wasn't just a parking lot for battleships, it was the entire infrastructure that let the U.S. Navy operate in the Pacific at all. Repair docks capable of patching a torpedoed hull in weeks instead of months, machine shops that could fabricate replacement parts on site, submarine pens, and roughly 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil sitting exposed in above-ground tanks just a few miles from where the bombs were already falling. Destroy that fuel, and the surviving American fleet has nowhere to refuel closer than California, 2,400 miles away. Pearl Harbor stops being a base. It becomes a graveyard. This wasn't just Nagumo's call in the moment. Weeks earlier, during war games held to plan the attack, Yamamoto himself had already ruled out one aggressive option, invading and occupying Oahu outright. He judged it too risky. It's a small decision that reveals a lot. Even the architect of the attack was thinking about how to survive it, not how to finish it. So why didn't the third wave launch? Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the strike force, blinked. He didn't know where the American carriers were, and the idea of his own fleet getting caught in open water by an unseen enemy terrified him more than the opportunity in front of him excited him. He called off the third wave and turned his ships home.
Historians have debated for decades what that decision cost Japan. What's not in dispute is this. Because the fuel and the dry docks survived, the U.S. Navy repaired almost every sunk battleship right there in Hawaii and had most of them back in the fight within 2 years. Nagumo didn't just fail to finish the job. He left the enemy's entire nervous system intact. Quick myth check before we go on. You've probably heard the line, Yamamoto supposedly saying he'd awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. It's one of the most quoted lines in war movie history. Yamamoto never said it. It was written for the 1970 film Tora Tora Tora. Historians have combed his letters, his diary, everything. The line doesn't exist anywhere before the movie. But here's the strange part. The fictional quote captures something real. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He toured American car plants and oil fields with his own eyes. Of all the men planning this war, he was the one who understood exactly what he was provoking. And what he actually feared wasn't a movie line. It was arithmetic. 3 weeks after the attack, President Roosevelt stood in front of Congress and set numbers that sounded insane for a country still digging bodies out of Battleship Row. 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 125,000 the year after, targets that most of his own advisors privately thought were impossible. They weren't. Auto plants that built family sedans the week before Pearl Harbor were retooled within months to build bombers instead. Enlistment lines stretched for blocks in every major American city. In that same stretch, the United States built 17. Pearl Harbor didn't cripple America's ability to fight. It removed the only thing holding that industrial machine back, a reason to turn it on. Japan bought itself roughly 6 months of naval superiority. It would spend the next 3.5 years watching that lead disappear, one shipyard at a time. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, at Midway, the U.S. Navy, using the very carriers Japan failed to sink, destroyed 4 Japanese fleet carriers in a single day. It was the moment the war quietly, irreversibly turned. Think about the chain that led there. A general warned this exact attack was coming in 1925 and was ignored. Japan's own admiral hesitated to finish what he started. And the fuel that let America fight back was sitting in plain sight the entire time, untouched. Pearl Harbor wasn't a masterpiece. It was a perfectly executed plan built on blind spots that had been sitting in the open for over a decade. The wrong target, an ignored warning, and a moment of hesitation that spared the one resource that could undo everything. Think about the chain that led there. A general warned this exact attack was coming in 1925 and was ignored. Japan's own admiral hesitated to finish what he started. And the fuel that let America fight back was sitting in plain sight the entire time, untouched. Pearl Harbor wasn't a masterpiece. It was a perfectly executed plan built on blind spots that had been sitting in the open for over a decade. The wrong target, an ignored warning, and a moment of hesitation that spared the one resource that could undo everything. Yamamoto got his 6 months. Then he got the war he always feared, one Japan was never built to win. He wouldn't live to see how it ended.
In April 1943, American codebreakers intercepted his flight itinerary, and fighter planes shot down his aircraft over the jungles of Bougainville. The man who planned the perfect attack never saw the ending he'd predicted play out in full, an ending that started the moment that third wave was called back.
If you want the full story of what happened at Midway, the battle that made Pearl Harbor irrelevant, follow us and hit subscribe for more deep dives every week. It genuinely helps the channel grow.